Alright guys, welcome to RC Mojo. This week we're putting together the front gearbox for the Porsche. It's fairly similar to the rear end, but of course without the motor. Okay, step 12, the front diff. We need 3 2x8 self-tappers, the star shaft, 2 large bevel gears, 3 small bevel gears, 2 large washers, the diff case and diff cover, and the tube of grease. The diff is essentially the same as the vast majority of Tamiya gear diffs. It's simple, but it works well and it's pretty tough. First we take one of the large bevel gears and add some grease around the flat area on the back. You don't need to be too even, just make sure there's a good bit on there. And then when the washer goes on, it's going to get spread out. Same goes for the grease we add to the washer. Make sure there's a bit all the way around the surface. And when that's dropped into the diff case, it's going to get squished and spread around the grease. Next we have the star shaft, where we need to grease up and slide on a gear to each of the shafts. It's just a case of adding a smear of grease to the tip, then spin on a gear so it picks up the grease as it goes. All 3 are the same, although by the time you get to the third, it can be a bit tricky to keep hold of it all, as everything wants to spin between your fingers. Now we pop the star shaft into the diff case so the ends of the shafts go in the slots. Tap it down so it's fully seated. Then we add some grease in and around the small gears. It doesn't need to be neat or tidy, as once the large gear goes in and the diffs get spun up, it will find its way around in no time. And speaking of the other large gear, we can pop it in and gently press it down so it's nicely meshed with the small gears. Then, just like the other one, we add some grease around the flat area, add the washer, and then we add some more grease. Now the diff cover goes on, so the pins go down into the slots to keep the star shaft in the right position, and so the screw holes line up with the holes in the diff case. Lastly, we fit the 3 screws, and keep in mind these screws have got absolutely nothing to do with transmitting the power to the wheels. They're purely holding the cover on, so we just need to take up the slack plus a tiny extra tweak and no more. Fit all 3, and that's the front diff ready to fit. Step 13, fitting the diff. For this one we need 4 3x10 self-tappers, 2 1150 bearings, A5 the front gear case, A3 the front skid, and of course the front diff. Now the diff just drops into the gear case through the big hole in the bottom. Tamiya would also like us to grease up the diff right now, but we can still access it through the small hole in the top. So to keep things clean, I'll wait until the next step before we actually add any grease. Either side of the diff we need to drop in a bearing. Then they should drop straight into position, but do check. If they got hung up, they might need a little bit of help. Next the skid goes on with the 4 screws. And an interesting point I rather like, the mounts for the lower front suspension arms are part of the skid rather than the gear case, making it far easier to repair after a front end impact. I remember on chassis like the TL01, the lower arm mounts were part of the chassis, so after a good meeting with a curb, more often than not you'd have to strip the whole car down to replace the chassis. Annoying enough that I still have a broken TL01 with one of the lower arm mounts broken from a crash probably about 15 years ago. Right, step 14, the bevel gears. We need 3 3x10 self-tappers, 2 1150 bearings, 2 850 bearings, a 4mm E-clip, 1 5x28mm shaft, the propeller joint, at least that's what Tamiya like to call it, the G1 bevel gear, the G2 bevel gear, 2 G3 end caps, and an A2 gear cover. To assemble the prop shaft, first we slide on an 1150 bearing. Then we clip the E-clip into the slot. The G1 bevel gear then slides onto the end and locks onto the flat on the shaft. The gear should slide all the way on, leaving just enough space for an 850 bearing on the end. For the second shaft, we pop a G3 cap onto one end, followed by an 850 bearing. Then the G2 gear, an 1150 bearing, and lastly the other end cap. Make sure everything turns smoothly and we're ready to assemble the gearbox. First we're going to add some grease to the diff gear. We just give it a little squirt, then turn the gear a bit and repeat until we've got a good bit of grease around the gear. Then the idler gear can go in, and if we turn it, we should start to see the grease transferring from the diff gear, distributing itself around. Now we can add some grease to the bevel end of the gear and drop in the prop shaft, making sure the 1150 bearing sits in its slot in the gear case. Again, if we turn the gear, the grease should go everywhere it needs to go. If it all looks good, then we can add the gear cover and screw in the 3 screws. Nip them up, and that's the front gearbox complete. You should be able to spin the end of the prop shaft quite freely without anything catching, although do remember the diff gear doesn't have an axle yet, so it might rub inside the case, but even so it should still turn without much issue. And well, that's it for this week. Bit of a short video, but we did at least manage to cover a whole parts bag in one go, even if it did only have 3 steps. Next time on the Porsche we're going to be on bag C, which is quite a big one. We've got the front suspension and the dampers to put together and mount. Some of it's fairly similar to the rear end, but there's still lots to do. And one last thing, this week should have been the Southern Scale Trail video, but I was too busy running the trail runner, chatting and drinking iced coffee. The only video I recorded was this one on my phone. I only went on the Sunday, but it was still a great day. A little bit of light rain and high humidity, but the trails were a great mix of slippy and grippy. Roll on next year. Anyway, that's really it, so as always, thanks for watching. Like if you like, subscribe if you haven't, and leave a comment if there's something on your mind. Bye guys!